I want to try to spend time summarizing what we've been doing in the previous sessions, where we've come. You're probably not particularly clearer on what things you should do and what things you shouldn't do than you started, but that's not the objective of a philosophy course in ethics. It's rather to try and give some ideas or suggestions about which sorts of things are relevant to decisions about right and what's wrong. Not to counsel you on which things you should do and which things you shouldn't, but rather just to sort of figure out what kinds of considerations might lie at the basis of such things. And in particular, we've been focusing on professional settings. We began by spending a little bit of time trying to figure out what professional ethics might be, and the one clear conclusion I hope to draw out of this course about that issue is that the professional ethics isn't some special breed of ethics that comes into conflict with regular ethics. It's not like that at all. There isn't some special thing, professional ethics or medical ethics or legal ethics or business ethics. None of these things are special breeds of ethics that are to be set off from normal ethics. Rather, there's just regular old ethics. There's trying to figure out what's right and what's wrong. One does this in a variety of settings. One is faced with ethical issues in a variety of settings, among them professional settings. And so what we do in professional ethics is to try to examine those special kinds of settings, to look at the special sorts of ethical problems that might arise there. But in the end, decisions that you're making about what's right and what's wrong are informed by the same general sorts of considerations that would guide you in any kind of a situation. We then spent some time, a couple of sessions, trying to talk about what regular ethics was. We went into some ethical theory. We looked at relativism and contrasted it with absolutism. We went on to look at a variety of different, more or less absolutist theories. First one that we looked at was egoism. We then looked at consequentialist sorts of theories. We looked at, even before that, at virtue-based or excellence-based approaches to ethics. We also looked at internalists or rights-based approaches. And what emerged from all of that was just a lot of conflict about what makes the difference between right and wrong. Different people seem to have all kinds of different ideas about what the basis of ethics is, what the foundation of ethics is. There's no end of conflict there. What might have been striking is that as much as people might disagree about their ethical theories, it's not necessary that they would disagree about their judgments in particular cases. For example, we talked about egoists possibly sanctioning acts that might for all the world look altruistic. I mean, if indeed it is in your best long-term interest to help others, well, that's what the egoist says you should do. And I don't know that we took this particular example, but just to sort of balance the ledger sheet, if indeed the best thing for society would be for each person to look out for himself or herself, it could very easily be that altruism would sanction courses of action that look for all the world like they were egoistic on the surface. So as much as people might disagree about their ethical theories, that won't necessarily make a difference in what they counsel as regards particular courses of action in particular situations. So that, I think, probably at that particular moment left you completely cold. Many of you said, I quit, I'm leaving, but you stuck it out and hung on a little bit longer. What ethical theories are supposed to be good for is just giving you some sort of guidance as to what kinds of things to look at. And if you walked away saying, well, maybe I should look a little bit at all of these different things that the different theories have suggested, I wouldn't be sad at all. It would seem to me like that would be not a bad thing to do, to take as prima facie good counsel each of the various theories about right and wrong, because there's wisdom to be found to some extent or another in each of them. What's prima facie mean again? At first glance or on the surface, right. So I would say while you can't be both an altruist and an egoist, it might be reasonable when trying to figure out what's right and what's wrong to consult both your own interests and the interests of others, and so on down the list. In the professional settings, we went on after, that was just a lot of stuff we talked about as regards general ethical theory. In the particular professional settings we looked at, we started out talking about all kinds of different considerations internal to a profession that might have some kind of impact on standards that professionals ought to take seriously as guiding their behavior. Among the different sorts of internal standards, there were we considered self-interest of the professionals themselves. That's something that might make certain demands on professionals and is not an illegitimate or an unreasonable thing for professionals to be concerned with. There's a service to society at large, the professional's own desire to provide service, to be a useful person, to do something productive within society. Not only the individual professional, but professionals in groups have this desire on their own. They don't need to be told or asked, or we don't. It's not just our demands on professionals that lead them to serve others. They're sometimes motivated to do that internally. That must be taken into consideration among the internal factors within professional life that guide professional behavior. There are the logical considerations, or as they might be called, platonic considerations, since Plato talked a good deal about them. These are considerations that you could figure out just by considering what the profession is, like automobile mechanic. If you just try and examine the nature of the professions, it would suggest certain sorts of standards, like when people bring their car into an automobile mechanic, the automobile mechanic ought to try to repair it, not instead, tear the thing up or wreck it or turn it into a flower pot or something like that. I mean, there's certain kind of as regards physicians, they're just not any old people like taxidermists who might be interested in human physiology. Physicians have a certain role, a certain set of standards that attach to their profession just because of what the profession is. In the case of physicians, helping people get better, healing them is one of the logical sources of standards of professional behavior. We also talked about romantic ones. How about those? What kinds of things do we have in mind when we talked about sources of professional standards that derive from the romance of the profession? Yeah.
Wearing of the uniform, the whole role-playing.
Yes, but where's the romance in that? I mean, there has to be something that's attractive about it. I mean, in general, I mean, these are the sorts of emblems, like uniforms, perhaps, that evoke the romance of a profession. But as a general rule, it's that same general category of things that we might refer to when we think of professions as a calling. It's those considerations that attract people to the profession. And when you understand the professions as somehow involving romance, and when you think about just exactly what how that romance or romantic vision of the profession might play itself out in the life of a person, you can see that it may very well guide behavior. It might guide, for example, professionals into acts of heroism, which they're not really obliged to do, but it's something about the romance of the profession that might make them, motivate them to behave not just in acceptable ways, but in actually heroic ways. None of these categories were supposed to be exhaustive. I mean, this list of categories wasn't supposed to be exhaustive, and they weren't necessarily supposed to exclude one another. There's a good deal of overlap among them. So if you say, well, if you find that it's difficult to classify some particular sources of of behavior, difficult to decide whether they should go in the romantic category or in the logical category or in one other. Don't worry about that. It may very well be that some things fall in more categories than one. What I was trying to do is to just get you to think about some of the many things that come from inside the profession that generate standards for behavior that professionals not only do deserve, but it makes sense. It's reasonable for them to observe these things. It's actually not only rational, but probably morally proper that they should regard all of these different things as important sources of guidance as regards their behavior. Unfortunately, they conflict with one another sometimes. They do not always act in harmony. And they certainly don't always act in harmony with standards that are imposed on professions from outside. Standards such as ones imposed by licensing rules, other laws, regulations that affect particular professions, demands that society makes. Now, this is before we considered the desire of the professional to serve society, but society also makes many demands on the professionals, has many expectations of professional behaviors, things that are actually imposed from outside. The ways in which a professional may think that she or he can make the best contribution to society may, in fact, conflict with what the society thinks the professional ought to be doing. So even on the simple question of how can the professional best serve society, there may be huge differences between what the professional or what even the body of professionals thinks and what the society thinks from the outside. So these things come into conflict as well. There's one other I wanted to... Oh, I distinguished as regards the external demands on professionals, because this was important. I distinguished between the demands that clients make. Some professionals have clients, many or maybe even most professionals have clients as part of their world of work. Not all professionals need have clients, but where professionals have clients, the demands of clients and the interests of clients may not be at all the same as the demands or the interests of society at large. These may come into conflict. It's not at all clear, for example, that as a general rule, the demands of the clients of lawyers are in harmony with the demands of society as regards particular cases. These can come into conflict. Lawyers are obliged to defend the rights of their clients. In some large sense, described just like that, defending the rights of clients. Well, that's in the interest of society. But think about the particular clients that lawyers get. Think about the particular acts that they've performed in many cases, or at least think about what they're accused of. Lawyers are obliged to try to serve their clients in particular ways which may seem like they conflict with those of society. So as regards the demands that outsiders make on professionals, there's the demands of clients, there's the demands of society at large. These may conflict with one another. They may very well conflict with some of the internal things. So what we got out of that whole story about the various demands made on the behavior, or on standards of behavior, the various sources of guidance for professional behavior, what we got out of that whole story is kind of a big mishmash, a big mixed bag of different sorts of considerations pointing in all kinds of different directions. Sometimes many of them might harmonize, but this is by no means necessarily the case. One's to expect that more often they conflict. And part of the purpose for just sort of listing all these different sorts of things was to emphasize the difficulty of making decisions in professional settings. Now, I want to say now something I said then. Professional settings aren't terribly different from just normal life in this regard. In our normal lives, whenever we have an ethical dilemma, it's often precisely because there are different sorts of considerations that lead in different directions. It's just in those cases, I mean, it's not every time this happens. When it doesn't happen, we don't feel like we've got a problem. We don't feel like we have an ethical dilemma. But when we do feel like we have an ethical dilemma, it's just because we've got different sorts of considerations that lead off in different ways. And it's there we need to make decisions. Not only because of the effects on us, but because of the effects on others. And it's in just those situations that at one level, the hope is that ethical theory, some of those theories that we discussed, might give at least some kind of initial guidance. What they'll do is to say, here are some things that you should think about. But where there's a huge welter of things, it might just seem bewildering. So in the light of all that, tried to talk a little bit about one of the attractions of a theoretical approach that we had discussed earlier when we talked a little bit about Aristotle and virtue-based or excellence-based accounts of ethics. The advantage to these accounts, the attractiveness of these accounts, is it suggests that we don't need to consider, all of this stuff. I mean, when we're faced with a decision that we have to make in a finite amount of time with a finite amount of information, the thing that we should probably focus our attention on over time is not trying to develop our cognitive powers, our intellectual powers, so we can quickly process all this data. Instead, what we should be focusing on is the building of a character, trying to increase our sensitivity to ethical decision-making situations, to try to increase our sensitivity to, increase our propensity to choose morally preferable courses of action. It's not always easy to define which those things are, but the general emphasis is to sort of focus our attention on trying to improve our character. This at least is what the theory recommends. It's attractive because it doesn't tax so much cognitive ability as it does on one's desire, one's will to do the right thing. And a place was even found for some of those other cognitive theories like egoism and consequentialism and the internalist theories, for example. A place was found even within this character-based approach, excellence-based approach, for those things when we talked about using those theories at first as the beginnings of developing character. I compared the improvement of character, this whole idea of trying to improve one's moral character, I compared that at first to the development of skill. And in the development of skill, whether it's a athletic skill or musical skill or any kind of dexterity, usually what you have to begin to do is you start thinking about it. You start by following rules. And in the ethical domain, it may very well be that those rules come out of one of those cognitive theories that we discussed earlier in the quarter. But that's just the beginning. You begin by following those rules, by trying to make ethical decisions in a rule-guided, and again, cognitive or intellectual way. But what that will do over time is change your disposition, change your habits, and eventually, again, still on this analogy with developing skills, eventually the hope is, the thesis was that we would become better and better at doing this, and we would be improving our moral intuitions, if you like. Again, on analogy with someone who's developing a skill who passes from the stage of being a novice, where you have to keep thinking about what you're doing, to the stage of the expert, where you don't have to think about that so much anymore. Indeed, where thinking about it sometimes may very well get in the way. That analogy with developing skills worked only a little bit of the way, though. We had to to, or I anyway, thought it was important to offer this caution. When people become very, very smug about their abilities to make ethically correct decisions, when they become very confident about their ethical intuitions, this is often precisely, when we do that, this is often precisely when people get themselves into the most trouble. The other analogy, which in some ways I admit conflicts with the first, nevertheless seems to me to offer an interesting way to think about that. If one has developed in one's character a commitment to doing what is right, part of that commitment should be not only a willingness to correct one's intuitions in the light of further experience, but a desire to do so. And here the analogy with modern experimental science seemed to me to be apt. In experimental science, the scientist is committed to the truth, to the whole idea of the truth, more than the scientist is committed to any particular theory, or at least this is the ideal, this is what one hopes. I mean, plainly this isn't going to be the case in the life of every scientist, but the ideal of science as such is the adoption of a particular way of doing one's work that allows one's theories to be corrected in the light of experience, in the light of experiment in the case of science. As I suggested that part of improving one's character, part of trying to establish a deeper sense of what's right and what's wrong, part of this ought to involve a commitment to doing what's right that resembles the commitment the scientist makes to the truth. In other words, rather than being committed to the idea that I am an ethically great person and all my decisions are correct, it's much better that I be committed to trying to make sure I correct myself where I'm wrong. Thus, I urged something like an experimental method in the building of one's character, one that reflects a certain degree of humility, a humility before the difficulty of ethical decision making. Okay. In the last couple of sessions, which sort of are the culmination of all of this, I talked about the general idea of institutional traps. Up until the last couple of sessions, everything that we said might suggest that people are faced with all kinds of different options that they can choose in professional life or in their lives in general, and that they're completely free to choose from among them. I wanted to argue, at least as a way of conceding something that I think is very important, that occasionally people find themselves in positions where they're not reasonably, practically able to make quite so many choices. Sometimes choices are forced. The extreme sort of example, this wouldn't be an institutional trap, but the extreme sort of example was the one I offered of somebody holding a gun to your head and saying, "Give me all your money." Now you could say, "No, I'm not going to give you my money. I like my money." But that would be kind of a silly decision. I mean, so in one sense, you're free to say yes or no, but not practically speaking, not reasonably speaking. If I gave my money to the person who held the gun to my head, and then later that person was apprehended, it would be ridiculous for the crook to claim that I had given the money of my own free will. If I said, no, he forced me, he held a gun to my head, everybody would understand what I meant. And I think everybody, in that sense of forced, I think most people would agree that sometimes decisions might be forced. In the case of the crook, it's a deliberate intention of the crooks to restrict the range of my decisions, down to where the only really viable one for me is to give up my money. It's something done intentionally. In institutions, it could be done intentionally, but it need not be done intentionally. Sometimes just as a byproduct of the way that institutions work, a byproduct of the way institutions are set up, it sometimes happens that, that people do find themselves in traps, in holes, in places where there aren't really a lot of different possibilities. I argued that such situations at least sometimes exist, and I wanted to at least vaguely suggest that wherever people's situations are harsh, wherever the consequences of any decision are dire, are bad, and furthermore, wherever well, first of all, in those situations you can expect people to act somehow, to try and do something to get out of the situation that they're in. And where the options are few, those are the sorts of situations in which you might find what I call institutional traps. Situations in which anybody, the best of people, who found themselves in that situation would probably do the same thing. Even though we on the outside might regard it as some morally reprehensible, I wanted to argue that if there ever is a situation, or wherever there is a situation, within which anybody, if they really found themselves in that position, would pretty much do the same thing, trying as hard as they could to do the right thing, those are what I have in mind by institutional traps. I argued that they sometimes exist. I didn't really make a claim that they're ubiquitous, that you could find them everywhere. I didn't, matter of fact, say much of anything about how often you can find them. Just wanted to argue that they are there. And finally, suggested that where they are found in professional life, where these traps are found on the job, where people are charged with making decisions, but where there really isn't any option except one in real practical terms. In those situations, it wouldn't be proper, actually, to hold the individual morally responsible for the decision that's made. The decision that's made flows from the situation. I wanted to beware of the possibility that this could just be used as an excuse, something that we should be very alert to. But just because it can be used as an excuse doesn't mean that it doesn't sometimes happen. It does sometimes happen. One has to be very cautious that people don't just start using this as an excuse. I have no doubt that we should be very, very careful about this. But it does occasionally happen. Where it happens, it would be improper to blame the person who's in that place for the decision. However, this doesn't absolve the person from all responsibility. Just because it's the professionals, we're talking about professional situations of this kind, just because it's the professional who's likely to be the only one who really knows about the details of these institutional traps, it then becomes something of a professional responsibility to call attention to them. So if a person is finding herself or himself in the same institutional trap over and over and over again, and this trap is leading to undesirable decisions or conclusions or results, it may very well be the professional's own responsibility to call attention to this so that something's done about the institution. An example I used was the Challenger incident, but I guess the conclusion that's most important to come out of that is sometimes there are defects in institutional arrangements that need just as much attention as O-rings do. I mean, remember that the Challenger disaster occurred because of a defective O-ring. And everybody would say, oh, well, that damn O-ring ought to be fixed. But institutions are products of human design as well. They're things that we make. They're things that we support. They do change over time. It's hard. They're very, very big. They're very, very sluggish in their changes. But they are the products of human ingenuity. And sometimes they're defective. And they're defective, I argued, precisely when they put people in situations where their decisions are forced, and those decisions then are undesirable, or lead to undesirable consequences. My objective through all of this has been mostly just to acquaint you with a variety of relatively general issues that bear on professionalism, professional ethics, guides professional behavior. From time to time, we've used an example from some particular profession to illustrate these ideas. But to this point, we've only discussed the general issue of professional ethics. It would require, I think, an application, a reflection of the bearing of these considerations on the particular situations that people find themselves in order to sort of bring this thing full course. Haven't done that here. It hasn't been the objective in this course of lectures, but I hope that I've at least helped to introduce you to a certain extent to the general field of professional ethics. Now, what I want to do is to open the floor to any discussion at all. We're now just, if any questions you might have. What I have just been trying to do is tie together the whole mess of material, give it some kind of coherence, some sort of logic, so you can see what it is that I've been attempting to do.